Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today, a shootout long in the making. I've wanted to compare these two watches since 2019. We have the Patek Philippe Nautilus versus the Chopard Alpine Eagle versus starts now. Zooming out a little bit, getting a better sense of these watches. They are very similar, one clearly inspired by the other, but the price points are so divergent. We have to consider, is the Patek worth potentially 10 times as much used as the Alpine Eagle? So let's start with the long-standing champion of the segment. The Patek Philippe Nautilus 5711, always well regarded amongst collectors, but it is now a market mania, and that's really just come about in the last 36 months. As I can remember, back in 2014, we would have bought this watch in the high teens and then sold it in the low 20s, and we're speaking of thousands of US dollars. Today, this is a watch that retails for $34,890 in its newest green dial variant and sells used in the variant you see here, which is discontinued, for about $110,000 to $115,000. The green dial variant, you don't even want to know, about 400 grand. Now, taking a quick look here, the watch is 40 millimeters in diameter. It is 8.6 millimeters thick. From lug to lug, it's not a really honest measurement of the case because you have these rigid end links that flare out, and you could see that the absolute distance across the wrist is actually 48.3 millimeters. Now, the watch still looks very much like Gerald Genta's original design, the 1976 Nautilus 3700, and the 5711, which was launched in 2006, has evolved slightly over the years. We'll talk about some of the changes in a moment, but the big changes were the new movement in 2019, which this watch has, and of course the arrival of the green dial for the final year of 2021. Let's throw the watch on my wrist, which is 16 centimeters in circumference. We'll get a sense of how this watch fits. It fits considerably more compact than the Chopard, and I'll demonstrate that right here. It is a flatter watch by some margin. The Chopard is 9.8. This is, again, 8.6. A real easy watch to wear, relatively short across the wrist. I could recommend it for a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference, and that is not the case with the Chopard. It's low, it's flat, it has a sloped case flank, it slides easily underneath a dress cuff. Taking a quick look at the bracelet, the detailing here is exquisite, and a big part of what you're paying for when you pay the premium over the Aquanaut is the complexity of the case assembly. You can see it's three parts: case back, the bezel with the wings, and then the mid case, and then the finishing on the watch as well as the bracelet with this lovely hairline bevel extended from the lug hood all the way down, the satination on the flanks, satination on the top, punctuated by individual polished intermediate links, and it is a very silken, thin, comfortable feel, really supple, almost more like fabric than chainmail. In 2012, Patek Philippe switched from screw-fixed removable links to pin sleeve fixed removable links. I do not like that change. It is very secure, but it makes it a lot harder to size this at home, and frankly, it did strike me as a cost-cutting measure, so I wasn't thrilled with that. Nevertheless, we have a very comfortable clasp, and you can see there are some investments here in newer technology as we have these ceramic pin snaps, the idea being over time, the steel of the clamshell lock cannot aggress against the ceramic, it cannot wear down the ceramic, so the tolerances will remain quite crisp. This locking clamshell is a feature that the Chopard does not have, so we have a little bit of extra security right there. Rolling over to the case flank, the 5711 did away with the monoblock construction of the original 3700 and its descendants. So we do have a separate case back, mid case, and then bezel with wings. The case itself is quite thin, satinated on its flank, lovely polished bevels, contrasting with the satin. You can see that the watch features a gradient from sort of silver blue at its center to navy, almost black at its edge. That gradient arrived for 2006. The blue with the horizontal strakes is original to 1976. And you can see that, like Gerald Genta's 1972 Royal Oak, we have a rounded polygon for the bezel, but unlike the Royal Oak, the inner bezel, the sapphire, and the dial also follow that contour. White gold hands, white gold indices. We have a black on white date disc. This variant with caliber 26-330 does include stop seconds or hacking, so if I want to stop the seconds hand, for the first time in 2019, Patek included that feature on the 5711. The post-2019 is the only way you will find that feature on a 5711, and then of course there is a quick set mechanism so you can rapidly cycle the date if you would like to. The watch does have exceptional lume, and we'll do a comparative lume shot rather than two separate ones, and around the reverse side you can see that caliber 26-330 SC, center seconds with a calendar. It's a 35 to 45 hour power reserve, 4 Hz beat rate, silicone hairspring, free sprung, 6 position adjustment. Patek swears this will run no worse than -3 + 2 seconds a day from the factory. All of this water resistant down to 120 meters and admirably finished with truly artisanal execution. Some of the elements are started by machine process such as CNC, electrospark erosion, or engine-turned beveling, but the bevels, for example, are finished up, and the remainder of the movement finished up by traditional means. So that right there is the Nautilus. Now let's talk about a watch launched in 2019, whereas the Nautilus draws its heritage from the original 1976 3700, the original Nautilus Jumbo. The Chopard Alpine Eagle harks back to the 1980 Chopard St. Moritz, which was one of the first designs launched under the Choiflet family's leadership of the brand, which was traditionally based out of Geneva. The Choiflets, as German jewelers, came over and acquired the brand, and the St. Moritz sports watch was one of their first products. So the timepiece, of course, drew even then from the design of the Nautilus and the Royal Oak, drawing heavily on the Gerald Genta designs, the integrated bracelet designs of the 70s. So that watch was, even in its day, a derivative design. And of course, when this watch came out in 2019, there was a lot of talk about how it was a rather shameless copy of the Nautilus, and while that's not quite true, it does reference the St. Moritz. It's important to recognize that even in its day, the St. Moritz borrowed a considerable amount of design language, but there are significant differences. Starting with the size, this is a much larger watch. On paper, true, 41 millimeters versus 40, but reality is that the watch wears quite a bit larger. Just as a Royal Oak 41 wears more like a 42 or a 43 round watch, that's really the case here. On my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, the watch is bigger, thicker, of course, 9.8 rather than 8.6 millimeters thick, but also broader across the wrist. You can see it'll slide underneath the cuff. Both of these watches will wear well with dress cuffs, but when I demonstrate the rigidity of the bracelet, you can see how I can't pull it straight down. So the absolute distance across the wrist is actually 53.6 millimeters from the rigid outcroppings that are incompressible, which is why I would say this watch probably wouldn't wear well on a wrist smaller than 15 centimeters circumference. Any smaller than that, there are going to be some issues. So I'm going to warn you, these watches are similar in size, but not in fit. Chopard boasts of using a special material called lucent steel. Now, it polishes up nice, but then again, so does the 316 used by Patek. They claim it is harder. My research on this suggests that we're only talking about 25 to 50 Vickers, with the Patek likely being around 200, and then this being somewhere between 225 and 250. Not a huge difference, but it's there. You can see it's not invulnerable. There's a little mark on the bezel right there, but it is beautifully done. As you can see, the bracelet is a lot more interesting to look at than the relatively flat and featureless Patek. So while this is probably finished with more machine assistance, you can see the combination of the center splines, which are polished and faceted, the dips between the links, the polished outer shoulder, the vertical satin finish on the side, the longitudinal satin finish on the top. It really is quite attractive, and I don't think you lose anything for the fact that this is probably a combination of manual finishing and machine finishing. Now, if you look carefully, you can see every individual link is removable using a screwdriver, so every link on both sides of the bracelet can be removed for precise sizing, a feature I adore. Now, it does feature a double fold like the Patek. What it does not feature is any kind of locking system. There is just a friction fit system whereby the swing arm compresses when you snap it into place, and it is a sequential fold. One side goes down before the other. So it's a very comfortable clasp that's probably better arced to the underside of your wrist, but it is not quite as secure at the limit as the Patek. Now, the case is interesting. A lot of satin finish, and not the longitudinal satin you usually see on the side of the case. This is all vertical, punctuated by polished polygons that are three-dimensional and have a nice prismatic quality. They have the look of a substantial foundation. And yes, we do have that winglet design. We also have a little bit of a hybrid of the Royal Oak and the Nautilus here, as we have that satin-finished bezel with beveled edges, but then we also have little screws fixed to the bezel, and well, the Nautilus doesn't include that, but the Royal Oak does. The key thing here, though, is that these are screws. They're not bolts like the Royal Oak. On the Royal Oak, there's actually a nut that holds the bolt in, and that's on the reverse side of the bezel. Here, we have screws that do hold the bezel in place, but because they're screws, not bolts, they can't be aligned perfectly, so they do have a little bit of variation in their orientation. The dial of this watch is simply a knockout. Better than the Patek, certainly more inventive. They call this the eagle's eye, as though it were the iris of an eagle's eye. And it's not a conventional sunburst. As you can see, it has very deep grooves. So it's a texture more than a pattern, whereas something like the Nautilus features a soft metallic glow. This has a texture like something you'd find on a glasuta original dégradé dial, as though it were stamped with the form. The spiral from the center features a number of different blue tones. It's rather like the denim dial on the Omega Seamaster Railmaster, and that the blue does vary from spot to spot, not in an organized fashion like a few may, but more of a modeled fashion that does look, truthfully, like something organic along the lines of, well, an eagle's eye. We have applique indices and Roman numerals at the quarters. It is an expensive looking dial with both color and texture. And if you look, we have a little date disc that is blue to match the dial, and that is not something you find on the Patek. 100 meters water resistant screw down crown, turn it all over, and you can see the caliber 0101C, 60-hour power reserve and chronometer certified, and those are the two big advantages it has over the Patek. Patek uses a rose gold rotor. Here we have tungsten. This is a lower priced watch. That makes sense, but it fills the case back properly. It is a manufacturer movement and a very accomplished timekeeper. So this timepiece, lots to love here. Let's evaluate advantages and talk about which watch I would rather own. So with the Patek, again, new $34,890. That's the last retail price for the last Nautilus with the green dial. This would have been a little bit less, but not much less. It would have retailed for about $33,600. So the watch now, as you see it here with the blue dial, is worth about $110,000 to $115,000. So if you do get an opportunity to buy a 5711 new, take it. This is the one to buy new because it will make you a rich man if you decide to sell it a little bit later. A time-tested original, not derivative. True, it was derivative of Gerald Genta's Rolex 5100 and Royal Oak, but it also has the Gerald Genta imprimatur upon it. It was his design. In many regards, it was an improvement on the Royal Oak. This design harks back to 1976, and this one harks back to a 1980s design that emulated the predecessor of this watch. So thin, better fit. Why not just put these two watches crown to crown, and you can see just how much thinner the Nautilus really is, and it's not even close. This is a watch that fits better on a small wrist. The reason I say this could wear on 13.5 centimeters circumference of wrist, and this needs at least 15, is because this is just a better watch for small wrists, for unisex use, and if you want to fit it underneath the cuff, both will slide under, but this being thinner is more graceful and better suited. I would also say that realistically, this watch features superior movement and case finish. There's going to be a lot more manual finishing of these components, both outside and inside, than you'll find on the Chopard. For example, here we have real white gold individual indices and hands, and then right here we have rhodium plated steel. The case, beautifully made, the bracelet beautifully made, but again, just a little bit more mechanical in execution. Where movements are concerned, it's not even close. Patek does use a lot of automated means that we discussed earlier to create these movements, but the final execution of the different finishes is always by hand, and with a gold rotor rather than tungsten, it looks more upscale even at a glance. The movement is a high horology movement, and while both are in-house and capable of keeping chronometer grade time, the Patek's is just more attractive in detail. This is, of course, the one with the clasp security. So the bracelet feels a little bit more delicate in the hand, and the actual swing arms are thinner in gauge. The lock is more secure, and I prefer to have some sort of lock to secure my potentially $115,000 sports watch to my wrist. So I would also say some advantages, technically speaking, include a silicone anti-magnetic hairspring that the Chopard does not duplicate, a free-sprung balance that's a little bit more rugged and adjusted in 6 positions rather than the Chopard's 5. I would also say that this watch with the Patek Philippe Seal 6-position adjustment, the silicone hairspring, and the Gyro Max free-sprung balance, this is a watch rated from the factory at -3 + 2 seconds per day, whereas the Chopard is chronometer rated. That doesn't mean it makes the bare minimum -4 + 6 per 24 hours of the COSC. It just means that Patek is putting a more ambitious number on its movement. The Chopard might be beyond chronometer spec, but it's COSC certified versus the -3 + 2 spec against which Patek will wager its warranty guarantees. So this is a watch that's rated to greater timing tolerances and also has a little bit more toughness built in with the silicone and the free-sprung regulator. Also, this watch has brighter lumen. You'll see that in just a moment. We may as well do it now. As you can see, the Patek is on the left, the Chopard is on the right, and while at first glance it might look like the Chopard has a little bit of an advantage, the lume fades faster on the Chopard, and you can even see it dimming a little bit already. My experience is after a few minutes in the dark, it's the Patek that retains the brighter glow, and I believe that's down to the grade of luminova that's used. Green is always the brightest. Now, speaking of the advantages of the Alpine Eagle, and there are many, let's start with price. This is the bargain. Whether you buy it new or used, new it's $12,800. Used, it's about $11,500 to $12,000, demonstrating impressive resilience on the market for a Chopard. Normally, I'd expect to buy a Chopard sports watch for about 60% of its original retail value, 60 to 65. This, again, selling used for up to $12,000 against a $12,800 retail, so far more affordable. Power reserve here. Here we have a 60-hour power reserve, whereas Patek offers guidance along the lines of 35 to 45, and the reason for that is if you're at 34 when the calendar starts to turn on the Patek, that can actually stop the movement, whereas here you get 60, which is a big advantage. The COSC chronometer certification is something that I find credible, but again, Chopard's not being clear about how precise this watch is. The COSC is a bare minimum, whereas Patek is giving you a very aggressive -3+2 per 24 guarantee, but still, power reserve here, a big advantage. No baggage. This is not the kind of watch that will lead to you being cased for robbery or invite unwanted questions about how much money you make or whether it's real or how much you paid. This is a watch you can enjoy not necessarily in anonymity because it will draw compliments, it is handsome, but you can wear it without any of the self-consciousness that comes with wearing a prominent status symbol. And I can also say that this watch is superior in dial detail. While it does not feature white gold hands and indices, this dial simply blows away Patek Philippe's rendition. This dial winds up looking almost colorless and flat by comparison, and while it is, quote, a classic, I find this to be a lot more interesting to look at and more imaginative. I would also say that the blue date wheel on a blue dial should be obvious and automatic, whereas the white here is a little bit jarring. And I'll also say the full modular bracelet, though not as artisanally finished, gives you a lot more sizing flexibility, and since you can loosen those retaining bars using a screwdriver, you can actually size this with a screwdriver as though the links were fixed by screws. And scratch resistance. Even though it's small, remember that the Vickers scale prejudices higher numbers in a way that's a little bit non-linear. So even if this is just 25 to 50 Vickers harder, it's a bit more scratch resistant than the Patek Philippe. The warranty on both is 2 years. So which watch between these two would I prefer to own? Frankly, it's not even a contest. It would be the Chopard. It's just as good a watch from a technical standpoint. It looks just as good from an aesthetic standpoint. My wrist is big enough that I don't have to worry about the fit issues. And while this is 120 versus 100 meters, I'm not going to push the limits of either one. The Patek is a nice watch, but there are elements that strike me as cost-cutting. The loss of the monoblock case in 2006, the arrival of pin sleeves in 2012, little things that you shouldn't find on a watch that costs even $33,000 new or $34,890 like the current Nautilus. So this is a watch that is nicely made, and it has all of the refinement advantages in finish inside and out over the Chopard. The Chopard is just a better deal, giving you 90% of the fun of the Nautilus, the excitement, the look, and the experience at potentially 10% of the price. I would also say that scratch resistant means a lot to me, power reserve means a lot to me, anonymity when wearing my watch means a lot to me, and the sizing of the bracelet is just common sense. Every high-end brand with an integrated bracelet should do that. So you guys let me know. If price is an issue, which one would you prefer? Tell me below this video. If price is no issue, which one of these would you prefer? Tell me below the video. I think if price were no object for me, the Patek is beautifully made, but even at twice the price of the Chopard, I would be no longer interested in the Patek. Even at retail, assuming I'm not just going to buy it to sell, I would not be interested in the Patek. Time out, Tim out, 2 watches out. Thanks for logging on.